new poll just came out that finds that Trump's support now equals President Bush's after Katrina. And that has major consequences for whether or not he's able to push his agenda through Congress. What's rocking Capitol Hill today, the resignation of Michael Flynn, why does this matter? Why should anybody care? Well, one very simple reason, it shakes up the politics of Washington extraordinarily. It sucks all the oxygen out of the room. So if Donald Trump and Republicans want to focus on a Muslim ban, if they want to focus on an immigration roundup, if they want to focus on repealing Obamacare, this distracts them from that.
The level of trust between the president and General Flynn had eroded to the point where he felt he had to make a change. The president was very concerned that General Flynn had misled the vice president and others.
Frankie D. Wiggins is saying TYT doing corporate media's job for them with Russia bullshit.
Okay, I mean, if you want to ignore the idea that Russia exists, I suppose we could do that. But without drawing any value judgments on the question, it's important for people to know the facts of what's going on. Michael Flynn, who was on the payroll of the Russian government, that's an established fact, during the transition, made a phone call and a bunch of text messages to the Russian ambassador talking to him about sanctions. And then when he was asked whether or not those calls happened and whether they talked about sanctions, he said, "We did not talk about sanctions." That was a lie. And I think people need to start demanding a little bit more from politicians, even Republican politicians.
General Flynn is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media, as I call it, the fake media in many cases. And I think it's really a sad thing that he was treated so badly. I think in addition to that, from intelligence, papers are being leaked, things are being leaked. It's criminal action, criminal act.
It's not okay to blatantly lie to the American people. It's not okay to get asked a direct question, did you talk about sanctions with the Russian ambassador, and lie about it. We were getting a question from a viewer here who said, why should we actually care about Russia? Who cares? This is not really something, this is not something that involves the U.S. political system.
Well, I would say three things. One is that our own national security is affected by what Russia does. Russia's a great power. Russia has nuclear arms, has probably the second biggest or the biggest arsenal, depending on how you count it, and they've been very aggressive. So what you don't want to have happen is another conflict to occur. For the first time since World War II, Russia went into another country and actually illegally annexed its territory. In other words, took over someone's land. That's the sort of thing that could cause a huge regional conflict. That was Crimea, and it was Ukraine, an ally of ours. And now they're on the eastern border of Ukraine, causing a lot of problems for Ukraine. I met with the ambassador from Ukraine last week. He told me on that day some soldiers had been killed, Ukrainian soldiers, again, our allies. So that's one part of it. Another part would be, what they are doing in terms of interfering, meddling in our own affairs. And this is why there is an investigation, but Russia has been very effective at misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and some call it propaganda. And they've also meddled in other countries' elections, whether it's France or Germany or now us or the UK. That obviously should concern us. And then finally, I would say in the Middle East, Russia really has not been a player there since the 1970s. I guess you can't say things are going great in the Middle East, but they could go worse. And with Russia allying with Iran and doing the kinds of strafing and bombing that kills a lot of innocent civilians, if you care about that and from a humanitarian point of view, it's been pretty rough in not just Aleppo, but which was the city where there was a lot of this bombing, but in other parts of Syria as well. And this is either Russian-backed forces or the Russians themselves.
Frankie Wiggins Jr. is still upset that we're talking about Russia. And I think if I could summarize the feelings of our audience, so many were invested in Bernie Sanders' candidacy. They're upset with the Democratic Party for not allowing him to win or to not voting for him. Some believe that the election was somehow rigged against him. And they don't understand why nobody writes stories about election rigging against Bernie Sanders, but they're writing stories about election rigging by the Russians, which they feel lets the Democrats off the hook for losing the election.
Right. And I understand that critique, but I think you have to separate what's going on here. Like, we're not talking about the election right now. Like, what happened with Michael Flynn is not about Russia's involvement in the election. Now, it's all bundled up in the milieu of it, but this is a completely separate thing. And think about this: if it was only about what Russia did during the election, would Donald Trump have fired Michael Flynn? Of course not. This is a completely separate thing, and I think people have to be able in their minds to say, okay, look, I don't want to hear Democrats blaming Putin anymore. Democrats put up a candidate that nobody liked, and she lost because nobody liked her, not because Vladimir Putin helped out Donald Trump. It's fine to say that, and there's no question about that. The separate question is, what is the relationship between the United States and Russia? What is the relationship between Trump and Vladimir Putin? Does that portend anything interesting to come? Is Vladimir Putin interfering with elections in Europe in order to help far-right parties there take power? Maybe that's one way to think about it. Do we want far-right parties, xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic parties that are going to break up Europe to take over there at the behest of Vladimir Putin, and where does that go from there? We have to be able to separate out the issues of the election with the issues that are going forward today. There's no point in relitigating the election.
People are trying to cover up for a terrible loss that the Democrats had under Hillary Clinton. I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated, and the documents and papers that were illegally, I stress that, illegally leaked.